So we're going to have a panel now, and my friend and colleague, Dr. Fred Berlin, is going to serve as our panel moderator. Fred's an associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. He's an attending physician at the Johns Hopkins Hospital, and he carries a joint appointment in the Department of Mental Health in the Bloomberg School of Public Health. He founded the Johns Hopkins Sex and Gender Clinic, where he serves as its medical director. And he also founded and directs the National Institute for the Study, Prevention, and Treatment of Sexual Trauma, a program that's been designated by the United States Department of Justice as a national resource site. Dr. Berlin has addressed a White House conference on childhood sexual abuse, various subcommittees of the United States Senate, and the College of Judges in several states. He's also provided consultation to the National Conference of Catholic Bishops and to the European Parliament. Dr. Berlin has appeared on 60 Minutes, 2020, Nightline, Good Morning America, Larry King, Anderson Cooper, Face the Nation, and Bill O'Reilly, who may have benefited from a little more time with Dr. Berlin, who treats sex offenders. His popularity with the media, I believe, stems not only from his considerable expertise about pedophilia, but also because he's never been shy about confronting an uncomfortable truth or staking out an unpopular stance. The importance of hearing from those who work directly with offenders is, I think you might agree after this movie in particular, undeniable. If we're to prevent child sexual abuse, we have to know what motivates and permits such abuse in the first place, and how to effectively treat those behaviors. As I said, Dr. Berlin today will serve as the moderator of our movie panel. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thanks, and it's quite an honor to be here. And I'm going to try to be more like the umpire of the ball game today, and not necessarily have much attention drawn towards me. I think there's an excellent film. I'm sure everyone would agree, and we're in a wonderful position here to hear from some of the people who've participated. I was actually reminded when I was watching the film, it was a movie made years ago by Woody Allen, and he was kind of, he'd just seen a play or a movie, and he was having this big intellectual debate about what the producer of the movie really meant to say. And then he imagined that the producer had walked up to him, and the producer said, "It's exactly what you think. That's just what I meant." Well, this will be an opportunity for us to talk to people who had something to do with the production of this film and see what you guys thought and how much that did or didn't correspond to what we think. So what I'm going to do now is just read out a little bit about our presenters. I think we heard about Jill this morning, but just to refresh memories of people who weren't here. Dr. Levenson is a professor of social work at DeBerry University in Miami, Florida. She's published over 100 articles about policies and clinical treatment designed to prevent sexual reoffending. Her groundbreaking research on the link between childhood advocacy and adult adversity, and adult criminality has paved the way for innovations in sex offending rehabilitation programs that now utilize a trauma-centered framework. And again, I think we saw this morning an excellent talk that you gave, just what that was all about. She has also been a treatment provider for over 25 years, as well as a scientist, using a scientific practitioner model to inform both her research and her work with clients. Dr. Ryan Shields, again, who most of you here know, is Associate Director of the Moore Center for the Prevention of Child Sexual Abuse and an Assistant Professor in the Department of Mental Health in the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. His scholarship is centered on the intersection of criminology, criminal justice, and public health. His recent work has examined policies aimed at youth who have sexually offended, such as transfer to adult court and sex offender registration and notification policies. He is currently leading a project to develop an online prevention intervention for adolescents with sexual interest in children. And again, clearly what he's had to do, the nature of his work fits in so well with the topics we've heard here discussed so far today and with the film. David Feige, and again, I hope I'm saying it correctly, who is the producer of the film, is a former trial chief of the Bronx Defenders, a co-creator of the TNT series Raising the Bar, and the author of The Indefensible, One Lawyer's Journey into the Inferno of American Justice. He has written or produced over 75 hours of scripted television, as well as written about law for the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, and Slate. A nationally known lecturer on criminal law and trial tactics, David served as a professor of law and director of advocacy programs for Seton Hall Law School. In 2004, he was awarded a Soros Media Fellowship, during which he wrote and produced a series of radio pieces about the criminal justice system. This is his first documentary feature, which is absolutely hard to believe because it just is outstanding. And I would have thought you'd done hundreds of these to get this good. I'm just privileged to be in the company of such distinguished individuals. I think I'm going to just start out by giving each of you a chance to make whatever comments you might want to make. As I said, I'm going to try to stay a little bit more into the background, and at some point we're going to take some questions from the audience. But David, if I can I, well, if you'd rather start with others, okay, we'll start in this
Sure.
side.
So I think the thing that struck me most from watching the documentary, there certainly wasn't a lack of strong opinions featured throughout the film, right?
Was today the first time you saw it?
No, this is the second time. And even just as powerful the second time. And in the film, we saw lots of different people from different backgrounds harnessing energy around reacting to sexual abuse in the form of registration, right? We saw policymakers and lobbyists and community leaders. So the thing that really just sticks in my mind is, what if we were to harness that energy for prevention? What could we do if we were able to direct those resources, financial and social, and direct it towards prevention? Like, we could change lives if we were to do that. But the reality is we still kind of remain in this reactive frame. And that's the thing that I think, we have to change. So that's sort of my impression from the movie.
Well, I think the movie's brilliant. This is probably the 6th time I've seen it, so. But it's like the first time every time. But the first time I watched it with some of my ACLU lawyer friends in my house in a private screening like last April. And for the first hour, we were like, okay, what'd this guy do? Like, it was all about, from the victim point of view. And then, it unfolded. And the next morning we woke up and we were all emailing to each other. Like, the more we think about it, this was just so brilliant how it didn't hit you over the head. It kind of allowed you to come to your own conclusion. So I've seen it several times since then. And David came down in March and we had a film screening. Is that okay to talk with? I don't want to steal your thunder. No. We had a screening in Miami on the street where some of these men live. And that was really very powerful. I'm a researcher, but I'm also a treatment provider. I'm a therapist. I see 30 to 40 people a week who are on registries, and some of them are homeless. In the Fort Lauderdale area, not Miami. So I've been kind of, living through this with my clients to some extent for the past 10 years, and I hear it, secondhand from them, and the hopelessness and the despair. And when we were down there that night with the tents and the guys and the people, it just, it was so powerful. And it really does bring home what it's like to watch, see what people, how people live. And probably the most poignant part of the whole night was at about 10:07, one of the guys, his ankle monitor started beeping, and he said, "Oh, I think I'm supposed to be on the other side of the street." And that's the kind of thing people go to prison for 4 years. So anyway, thank you for opening up this dialogue.
It's funny. It's funny that you talk about the Miami screening because, first of all, I really enjoyed watching you watch this because you were a very different audience than what we usually have. But it is true that one of the more meaningful screenings that we've had for me was going back to that parking lot, which is where I met Clyde. And early on during the filming, I had said to the guys, when I'm done, I'll find a way to make sure you see the movie. And it was abundantly clear that the only way that was going to happen was renting a mobile projection unit and an inflatable screen and getting a permit from the cops and literally closing off that piece of and showing the film. But what's interesting to me is I walked away from that screening feeling deeply sad and completely overwhelmed by the irrelevance of film. Because the most poignant thing for me was that as we were leaving, two of the guys were like, excuse me. I'm like, yeah. And they're like, are you going to leave the porta potties?
Oh, God.
And I'm like, no, I'm so sorry. They're going to probably pick them up first thing in the morning. And I realized we're making a movie where people literally are hungry and need a place to pee and a place to sleep, and that there are so many basic, profound, extraordinary needs that even watching a movie is operating on this whole other level. And so, yeah, we need to change the policy. We need to address the issues. We need to create a world that is evidence-based and responsive to reality. And we also need to just find porta potties for these guys. And so there is an enormous, there's an enormous need out there. And so the film was designed to start a conversation. As you saw, there was not a single policy prescription in there. I tried somewhere halfway along making it, because I'm polemical by nature, and I think that the extent to which I grew as a filmmaker during this film was having a realization, while we were editing and the election was coming up, and I realized, 58-42 is a landslide. Mm-hmm. And you can either make a movie that is polemical, but that preaches to the choir, or, as my mentor in TV writing, Stephen Bochco, used to say, drama only exists in the titanic clash of legitimate worldviews. And so maybe what you do, and what I ultimately did, having found Ron, was aim dead down the middle, and then just kind of gone just a little bit, with the idea that this is a film that can appeal to people who have loved ones on the registry, and can move people who themselves are victims of sexual abuse, that gives voice to both sides of an unbelievably difficult problem, and starts a conversation that results ultimately in the acknowledgement that we need to do something. And I think that there is some value, I hope, despite my sadness about the lack of porta potties, I hope and cling to the idea that there is some value in creating the very first thing, and I think it was it whose slide? I think it was Elizabeth's slide that had the sort of how do we get things done, and the first thing was surveillance, right? Which is just identifying the problem. And there's a somewhat modest aspiration there. Just, here's a problem, let's deal with it. So
I want to make a comment. I'm sorry, just a question. As I said, I'll try to stay out of it as much as I can. But you said this was just a movie, and with respect, I'll disagree with you. I mean, this is about life. It's about our perceptions. It's about caring about human beings that we need to learn more about. So again, I'll keep it short. But this is much more than just a movie. I don't want you to sell yourself short. The other, just quick question. You mentioned in front of other audiences, you sometimes have a very different reaction, and that just made me curious. Can you just expand on that slightly?
Sure. It's not that there's a different reaction so much. It's that because you guys are such an informed audience, you saw stuff coming way earlier. So that it takes 3 years to make a film. And by the way, I didn't mean that as sort of false modesty. Obviously, I spent 3 years making a movie because I hoped that it would do something and mean something. I just always try not to lose sight of the fact that there's other very real need out there.
We got to go home that night.
Yeah, that's right. We got to go home that night, and they slept in cardboard boxes. But in answer to your question, other audiences don't really turn on Ron until much deeper in the film. So the fulcrum tends to be right, whereas I could feel that you guys were like, what? Early on. So it's and I could feel, so most audiences, if you go to, as I did, Minneapolis last week where we did a screening with Patti Wetterling, or Cleveland 2 weeks before that, people, whoever they are, who actually come off the street to go see a movie about sex offenders, which presumably just meant everything else was sold out, come in and they are far more empathetic with Ron and Lauren for far deeper into the film before it starts to turn. So I think that was by the time we got to Senate Bill 1666, There were like gasps. You guys were like, ah! Whereas most audiences are kind of like, and so that was the major difference.
Right.
I would say.
Joe, I might have cut you off. You look like you wanted to say something.
Well, I guess I was just thinking, this film, I think it is uncomfortable to watch. It's hard to watch. It's disturbing. It's disturbing for me. Each time I see it, it's still disturbing. But it forces us to think about kind of the big picture and the ripple effects. And so from a prevention point of view, it's clear probably to us on some level that you can't try and solve the problem by creating more trauma. And not just trauma for the people who have been convicted, and there's not a lot of sympathy for them, and I get that, but you see the ripple effect of their families and their children. I have clients who own their own homes and are not allowed to live there. People who have children and parents and family members who are dependent on them, and they're not allowed to live in their homes. And I guess for me, it has also brought home just how fundamental the idea of having a home is. And when you don't, it disrupts every single other aspect of stability in your life. And especially when these are people who want to be working, want to be stable, may have dwellings they can live in, have supportive family members who would welcome them in some cases. And they're like dumbstruck by trying to understand how this can be and how this is allowed to occur, to legislate people into homelessness.
Are there any comments?
Yeah, the thing that I've been thinking about, let's imagine a world where registration policies were effective and inexpensive, so widely used. Let's imagine that world. The fatal flaw is that we still are waiting for harm to occur. Mm-hmm. So even if those things weren't happening, the fatal flaw is that we have to wait for harm to occur and then we react to it. Mm-hmm. And that to me is an unacceptable policy position. For me, it's about, is this effectively reducing child sexual abuse? And it's not. So why are we directing all of our energy towards something that's not effective and waiting for this harm to occur?
Well, thank you for bringing us back. You're so eloquent. How do we break the cycle?
Well, how do we get beyond also preaching to the choir? I mean, This is obviously a group of people
Go out
who...
and show the film to other people.
Well, that's really a point I was going to make. I mean, I think what really impressed me here is that you really were, I think, very fair to everybody. I know that we're all going to have certain feelings about some of the folks in the film, but you showed them in the complexity that they have as human beings. I mean, yes, we can get mad, but here's a father who is just hurting because of something that happened to his daughter. He's not an evil person. And so I think that is the challenge. We live in a world where we have very different perceptions, very different ideas. We can do a lot with data up to some level, but we also have to get people at the level of emotion. That's where I think the kind of work that you've done here is so terribly important. You have to tell a story at a level that's personal. I was thinking the other day about where we were with alcoholism before the Betty Ford Clinic. If a woman had a drinking problem back then, we just said all sorts of terrible things about her. Then we put a name and a face on it, and we said, gee, there are decent people who are struggling. I was particularly touched here by those who were both victims and then became victimizers, and the challenge that presents to their families. Somebody once said that the definition of a liberal is a conservative whose son just got arrested. And I think there's certain truth to all that. So, but my biggest concern is how it's an evolution. It takes time. But how do we get public perceptions to change, particularly when there's so much emotion and such strong feelings and such commitment to ideas that already exists out there?
Well, I think I should say in response to three things. First of all, I think that is the central conundrum that I faced when deciding to make, what a friend of documentary filmmaker friend of mine described as adopting the ugliest baby in the orphanage. By taking on the least popular, the most difficult, the most marginalized, imaginable subject, and then very conscientiously saying, I'm not going to do a film just about Shauna. That, by the way, would have been easy. People would have liked that.
Yeah.
People like, nice young women who work, white women who work really hard and get screwed and have to spend their lives on the sex offender registry. But rather to then say, you know what, we're going to also include John Cryer, who looks dead in the camera and says, for most of my life I've been a pedophile. But that's what complexity and nuance, to my mind, are about. And so, look, I think that storytelling is crucial. Putting a human face, the reason I chose this way of doing it is because I do think, or I hope, that this is a way to get people to wrestle with the subject in a way that begins the conversation and is ultimately grounded in science and fact. And so, yeah, so for me, go if you can, show the film. If you have access to legislators, have a screening. If you have a not-for-profit, let me know. Send me an email. I have a person, a human, who actually just does educational and not-for-profit screening, arranges educational and not-for-profit screening stuff. So that is part of it. And then I will tell you a funny story, because we showed the film to Ron Book after we had our insurance policy bound. And a true fact. And Ron and Lauren flew up before we premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival. And Ron and Lauren flew up, and we had a little screening room because we showed pretty much everybody who was a major character in the film got to see the film just before it premiered, when it was done. And Ron and Lauren show up with popcorn, and I'm like, it's not exactly a popcorn movie, but okay. Sweet. And it's my field producer Adam, myself, my producer Rebecca, and Ron and Lauren and Claire, who's sort of Lauren's chief of staff / minder person who you see in the film sort of tangentially. And, there's a little harumphing through the film, and I'm like, oh God, this is going to be really bad. And, it ends, we let the credits roll for a minute, the lights come up, and we're like, and Ron thinks for a good 15 seconds, and Lauren's just looking at him, and Ron goes, I loved it. And I'm like, and he says, and he says, I love it. And I said, well, that means a lot to me, because I want to know whether you felt that it honored your experience and gave voice to your point of view. And he said, yes. And he goes, but there was one thing I hated. And I go, okay, what was it? And he goes, guess. So I said, shoe shine? He goes, no, that was fine. I go, naked shaving? He goes, nope, that was okay. I said, driving? He goes, nope. I said, I have no idea. And he goes, I hated that comic. At the beginning, the Louis C.K. bit, at the very beginning. He hated, because he felt the thing that really made him angry was that he felt that it was making fun of the situation. And I said, well, it's interesting, Ron, we wrestled with that a lot. And I'm interested in how you saw it as well. I'm always interested in how audiences see that one piece, because it is the one moment of sort of quasi-comic / non-comic relief in the whole film, except for the little driving and I did have a shark in my tank. The point of that, as I explained to Ron, was this is known as an epic comedy fail. It's there because it's so awkward and it's so painful that it sort of tells you this is a subject you can't even joke about. Not even when you're Louis C.K., not even when you're on Saturday Night Live. And he was like, I want to watch it again. And I'm like, well, you're coming to the premiere. And so after the premiere, he's like, okay, I see your point. So anyway, that was the Ron of it all.
Thank you. I did have a follow-up, and not just me, but maybe the other panelists can comment. But you mentioned, and it's tremendous, you spent 3 years in doing this. It was a close to a 2-hour film, which never lost our attention, I think.
Yeah.
But having said that, you have to decide what was in and out. And are there things that you wish you could have gotten in there that you did?
Oh my God, yes.
Could you talk to that?
I have a little more than 15 really good minutes that called for many, many, many hours on civil commitment. We followed the Minnesota case that's going to the Supreme Court right now. We followed one of the named plaintiffs.
Is everyone
Eric.
familiar with civil commitment? This is where people who've served their time, rather than being let go, are then all of a sudden in need of treatment, and so we don't release them. And in most states, it's really turned into making them all have life sentences because they were supposed to get out, get a new start, and they can't.
Yeah,
So
it's
just
the
a-
one place in America where we lock you up not for what you've done, but for what you might do. And in Minnesota, there are over 700 people civilly committed, and in the 22 years that the program has existed, guess how many have gotten out? No one has ever gotten out. So we have this, so civil commitment went by the wayside, which was heartbreaking. I had a little great tidbit about the penile plethysmograph, which is its own form of lunacy, went by the wayside. There were two characters who I just loved to death. Travis and Micah, who appear. We used to have a segment that was at the ROS, of the Reform Sex Offender Laws Conference, where we had followed one of our characters, and at the RSOL conference, you never saw this. A big rig rolls up playing country music, and two guys get out. One's in an NRA shirt. He tucks a Glock in the back of his pants, and you think, oh my God, they're going to go shoot up the sex offenders, and you cut to them coming in, and then you start the voiceover, and what you learn is that they're both registrants. They met at the Texas Division for Youth. Both of them were jailed for most of their adolescence for homosexual experimentation, and they now live together and drive and are long-haul truckers.
And they're allowed to have guns?
What? Well, no. I pointed this out to him, and he's like, I don't care. And I'm like, I don't think you're... Anyhow, no, they're not. Although, well, it's interesting. Because it's not an adult conviction, and he wasn't registered, so I'm actually not sure, but I did point it out to him. Anyway, he's on the cutting room floor, so it didn't matter. So there were an enormous number of unbelievably compelling stories. I have very much wanted to make a bunch of sort of short films from the odds and ends and stuff like that. But
Well, I was actually thinking that. I mean, it could be a wonderful series, and again, to educate people.
If I had the time and the money, I would do it. No, really. I mean, I'm working on a couple.
I'm not joking.
I'm working on a couple of them, hopefully for the New York Times. But the problem is that short films. I mean, no film documentary, no thing pays, but shorts in particular. Like the Times will give you $2,000 for a film that'll cost you $15,000 or $20,000 to make. So that's hard. Anyhow, yes. So the answer is there are a bunch of issues and a bunch of characters, all of whom are on the cutting room floor, and all of which are amazingly compelling stuff. But at the end of the day, you're constantly cutting stuff down, and the film for a doc is still quite long at 104 minutes. So.
Yeah. Also, the other are there things that you folks would have liked to, and I'm going to take some questions here from the audience. Are there other things that you would have liked to have heard more about or seen more about in this particular film?
I don't know. I'll have to think about it. I'm sure I'll think of it when I'm driving home.
The one moment when you asked Ron, which of the policies,
which of these laws,
which of these laws would have,
yeah,
that was a very brave moment.
Yeah.
I think that's a brave question to ask. And then was there an additional either pushback or because that's a pretty direct.
Yeah, I mean, I did hours and hours of interviews with Ron. It will not shock you to know that Ron likes to talk. It will probably not shock you to know that Ron. I mean, they're not kidding. When that legislator says 40% of all the bills passed in Florida have Ron Book's fingerprints on them, they do. This is a guy who has almost never failed to convince anybody of the rightness of his point of view, and as a consequence. He's, in a way, incredibly loquacious, and in a way, incredibly closed off, but he's very smart and very cagey. And so we had this very he liked this. Mm-hmm. He liked the little chess match of it all. Mm-hmm. And so I never challenged him in an angry way. I never challenged him too much, but it was a lot of that kind of stuff. How would that have happened? Or why? Tell me. And he would just sort of go on. So thank you. I will say this. There was one other moment that also isn't in the film. We opted for the version. Remember when Lauren's reading the book and Ron's in the back threatening Waldina?
Yeah.
So that was not the only time he said that stuff. He said to me repeatedly, I'm going to be 73 when she gets, I'm going to be waiting in Honduras. I'm going to be waiting. And at one point I did say, Ron, are you actually, we're rolling. And I said, Ron, are you really saying that you're going to go murder her? And there's this long pause, and he goes, no, look. And then there's this, but there is at least some sense for him that this almost biblical expiation of guilt will not be complete until she's dead. And it was very intense. So we sort of included that version of that moment, partly because the contrast, but it was the beginning of pulling them apart, right? Where she's doing her thing and he's still mired in his anger, and then she starts talking about, are you pensive? And then they start sort of pulling apart in the Times Square scene.
And I think you did a great job of capturing that, and I know it from my interactions with him over the years, that he really is a tortured soul. He's in incredible pain and has a lot of guilt about what happened.
Oh, yeah.
And that just means that the only way he knows to try and channel that is what he's doing.
Yeah, I'll say one other thing about the film, which is we got into Tribeca before we had shot Patti Wetterling. I had tried for 2 years to get Patti. She was the chairman of the board of NEMIC and felt that it would be inappropriate of her to talk. And she stepped down, I think January 1st her term ended. And we had already gotten into Tribeca, so it was premiering March, something, or late March, early April. And the film was supposed to be locked. And we were still, we're still editing, and my field producer Adam is like, we should call Patti Wetterling again. I'm like, dude, I'm done with Patti. I'm not a stalker. That's not how I roll. Like, I ask people, ideally they say yes, and then we go have a nice, long, honest interview, and she's made it clear. He's like, dude, we have to get Patti. And I said, Adam, I'm done. And Adam, because this is what you want in a field producer, we're in the edit room, and he dials her cell phone, and she picks up. And Adam's like, Patti, it's Adam Pogoff. I have the director here who wants to talk to you, and he hands me the phone. And I'm like, Patti, I'm so sorry. It's like, and she says, well, now that I'm not on the board, I'd like to know more about your project. And so I tell her, and we hang up the phone, and she has said yes. And I'm like, when are you free? And she goes, well, I don't know, like this weekend? And I said, we'll be there. I hung up the phone. I'm like, Adam, book us all tickets to Minneapolis. We're going to Minneapolis. We're going to shoot Patti. We're going to shoot Patti Wetterling. And we went, obviously, to the house from which Jacob was connected. And we did this interview that just left us all, eviscerated. That it was so painful. She's so exquisite and it became immediately clear that she could exist. She could fill this place in the film that I had never fully grasped was empty, which was a different response than anger.
Yeah,
That you can be aggrieved and not do that. Gave this entire other layer and texture to the film without ever saying it. You feel very deeply that there is this other way, and it leaves at the end of the film. It leaves Ron in that shot where he's alone at his desk, still stewing, and you have this sense of his being captive to his own fury, held hostage by his guilt in this way that we wouldn't have been able to do without Patti saying, I refuse to live in that world. I refuse to do that. I have to believe in building the world that Jacob believed in. Which to me, like every time I watch it, and I've seen it more times than I can count, it still kills me.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you got her. We were lucky enough a couple of years ago to have Patti speak here at this conference. And, once in a while you just meet a human being that you think is a role model of what we ought to evolve to as human beings. And she's really
She's
that.
extraordinary.
And, just a terrific person. I did want to get a few questions from the audience, and I'm just doing them in the order that I see them on these cards. I can answer this too, but I'll put it to the panel, and I'll caution you. This is one that's similar to a question that caused a lot of problems for a former individual who was running for president of the United States. He was asked at the time what he would do if it had been his wife who had been raped. So the question is, please share your thoughts on number one, how would you feel if a child molester lived next door to you? That's number one. And two, if your child got molested and the offender was allowed to live or work amongst children, how would you feel? So again, I can answer that, but let me open it up to the panel.
I think that's a perfectly reasonable question. And it relies, but my answer relies on this very fundamental distinction, which is there is a distinction between a human reaction and a policy reaction. Okay? You can be angry. The reason the point of the film in a way is that and Jill made it beautifully in the film, is we don't just let powerful people express their anger in policy. That's bad, right? So would I be angry or frightened? At this point, after doing what I did, probably not, but I could understand how anybody would be. At the same time, it's crucial to understand that, and it's precisely my argument, by the way, about the death penalty. Our society needs to aspire to be greater than our own base instincts. Of course you want to kill the person. That doesn't mean it's right. And so collectively, we try to do better than we do as individuals. So in answer to the question, honestly, at this point, I don't actually think I would worry, because I know what I know and I've been so steeped in it. But had I not done that, I would fall back on this distinction between what's okay as an individual and how you react as a society.
Exactly, and that's, I think, was it Dukakis who was the one that was, I've forgotten who was asked running for president.
I think it was, no, it was, because, was it Bush?
No, it was a Democrat.
No, it was a Democrat. Which,
but at any rate, I think you gave the answer. I mean, the failure and the answer that was given at that time was to acknowledge the human emotion. Then,
right.
Of course, I would be outraged. I'd want to kill that person, but then to add, but we then have a responsibility to think it through, and it wouldn't be right for me to kill them, nor would it necessarily be right for society on my behalf to kill them. But you have to show the humanity, the human side of it first. And by the way, all of us have people who have molested children living in our neighborhoods. It's really a false question. And as someone who's worked in this area and treated people, I know, because some of these are people that I've treated, that they've lived in my neighborhood. So we all want to protect our children. Nobody differs on that. There are differences about what is the best way to go about doing that. What I think has been so terrific about the presentation today, the film, the panel, is we're having a dialogue trying to sort that out.
Yeah.
Others want to take a crack?
Well, I was going to say what you just said, which is the sex offenders have always lived amongst us, and they always do. Just because they can't live near a school or a park doesn't mean that they're not living next door to a family or a kid. But people have to live somewhere, so they've always been living near us. And of course, we're just here talking about people who have been caught. Much of sexual abuse goes on, and we don't even know it. In answer to the second part of the question, though, I would say, first of all, one of my daughters was victimized as a young adult. And I'm sure for many of us have family members or people close to us who have been victimized, and so we have to deal with that helplessness as a parent. But when you talk, and you all know this too because many of you are counselors, when we talk to victims of sexual assault or children who have been abused, children really just want the abuse to stop, usually. They want to feel safe. They want their life or their family to be normal and safe, and they want it to stop. And adults who are sexually assaulted, very often what they want is an acknowledgement of accountability and an appreciation for the harmfulness of what has been done to them. And so I think that when we try to view things with compassion and empathy, not just for ourselves and our loved ones, but also for other people, then we can try and figure out how to heal from things without vengeance, I guess.
Yeah, it raises an issue I've thought about, and I want to get back to the questions from the audience, but do we as adults sometimes not allow children to express what they're actually feeling when they've been abused? Do you have any thoughts, any of you on that? Because we understandably are outraged. We have an instinct of wanting to protect our children. And yet, I think even in this film, there was this comment, well, she was important in my life. I loved her. She loved me. It wasn't just this all black or white. Either it was a terrible villain or a wonderful person.
Right. I didn't want to
I think children, would you comment on that?
No, yeah. I mean, these guys, I think, but yeah, they're in the film. Lauren says, I didn't want to tell. I loved her. And I think, and that sort of is a thread that goes all the way through to Eric Janis's point at the very end, which is part of the problem with these super draconian penalties, is that they actually inhibit is they actually inhibit reporting, especially in families, because the consequences of 50-year mandatory minimums and, you know, mandatory reporting and all this other stuff are so severe that there's no middle ground for a potential resolution, whatever that is, absent absolutely, you know, blowing up the family unit.
Well, so you know, policies are enacted, I think, with good intentions. So they were talking about this law in Florida that I don't know that it actually passed. It may have been
1666 did not pass.
right, but
But-
the piece I
Wait,
think
it
was
just
resurrected
reintroduced. Lauren
this
Book
year.
sponsored
Yes.
it. Lauren Book sponsored it again this year.
That if you have a conviction for a sex offense, that your rights to your children would be terminated.
Presumptively terminated, yeah.
And, right, which again, you know, maybe sounds good in theory to some people, but when you think about then the pain and damage that does to a family and to the children, you know, who have that parent, it's, you know, it's a different dimension, it's a different side of it.
I wanted to make a comment about prevention, because this is what many of us are into. At the clinic that I work at here, we're seeing a number of people come forward because they're worried that either they or someone in their family has been accessing child pornography. They're not been caught, and we're helping these folks. I may be mistaken, but I think California either passed or is going to pass a
they
law mandating that those people be reported. And what that's going to do is interfere with prevention. The people now who haven't been apprehended, who coming in, getting help, will simply be driven underground. And it's again an example of policies that are really well intended. They're interested in helping kids, and in my judgment can actually have a counterproductive effect. Sorry, Ryan, did you want to make a comment?
Well, Joe was just mentioning our Help Wanted project, sort of in line with this idea of, you know, when do we provide help? Do we provide help after something has happened or before when someone's looking for help? And I think that's sort of a question that we as a society need to really kind of confront. And so we are working on a project, as Fred said in my bio, that is online intervention for adolescents who have a sexual interest in children. So before they've acted on it, but are looking for help and currently can't find any. And so it's a new frame. And again, I know it's like I'm one-hit wonder, but we have to start thinking through the lens of prevention. That's just.
And that means that
Yeah.
people have to be able to feel like they can reach out for help if they want it before they do something. And so, yes, that law passed in California that made viewing of child pornography under mandated reporting. And Delaware, which may affect some of you who are in Maryland. Maybe there are people who live in Delaware but would go to a counselor in Maryland to avoid that if they knew that it had to be reported. And there has been a lot of outcry from mental health professionals about how that really does challenge the very foundation of trust and confidentiality in a therapeutic relationship. But if somebody comes to a therapist's office and says, I want help, I feel like I'm attracted to kids and I don't want to harm anybody and I want to understand that and I'm looking for help, counselors need to be prepared to respond to that ethically and effectively and without freaking out and without shaming and without making people afraid to talk about it. That's prevention.
Okay, I'm going to get kicked off the podium here in a minute, but there were two audience questions. I'll just try to squeeze them in. Again, it's been terrific.
And I'm
I know
happy to
there's
talk
lots
to anybody
out
outside.
there, but one is sort of, and I thought of it too, there's concern that the length of time when the study's looking at recidivism are relatively short. And,
Right.
people will say, well, if you just would have waited, there'd have been more. So I just wanted to throw that out there. Then the other was a couple questions along this line, but just what can everyday people do to try to do more about prevention? We're talking about here, but what can people in the audience who are wanting to do something, what can they, so those two issues, and then we are going to have to stop.
Yeah. Well, I think the answer to that is to take any opportunity you can to be a role model in the life of a child. And that when we come across kids and anywhere, maybe in our life or peripherally in our life, or even in the supermarket, and you see somebody's parent is berating them in some way, to respond somehow with kindness, to make children feel that they are special and important and worthy, and that adults can be trusted, because every little time that happens, it adds to the child's repertoire of understanding about the world. And that's what's going to prevent people, I think, from growing into people who harm others.
And I would say, and I would take a slightly different approach. I would say, be a champion of truth. Be courageous. Be courageous in dispelling the myths that are so pervasive and so commonplace and come up every time. Be an advocate. Be an advocate for science. Be an advocate for truth. Be an advocate, and be an advocate for challenging those shibboleths in your daily life. It may be as simple as correcting the record. Say, actually, you know what? That's just not so. So that would be my answer. I'm going to punt on the longer studies. It's complicated, and we can talk about the methodology and the meta studies and all that other stuff. And the answers are that sometimes you do in fact get higher rates. You can thin slice the data to cleave off certain people who have various static 99 scores, et cetera, and I can talk about that outside, but it'll bore the hell out of most of you now.
I don't think it bore any of us, but I want to thank the panel. We really appreciate it. I think excellent presentation.